everybody. Thank you for joining us for our Marijuana 2019 and Beyond State Legislation and Trends. I am excited that you are here to join us. I think we have a really good presentation for you. And this is absolutely meant to be interactive. So you are free to chat us questions or use the question feature. Either way, we'll get them. And we will either stop and answer them if that's what's needed based on your question, or we will gather them all up and have a conversation at the end with the questions you have. So you can ask things that you would like answered right away, or you can save your question to the end, up to you. And we will also use our judgment, but please do interact with us. Let us know what questions you've got as we're going along. We will also be recording this webinar, so it will be available afterwards if you want to go back over anything we've talked about. You will also get this presentation mailed to you tomorrow. So you will get all of these links. So all of the studies we're going to share, all of the statistics, all of the numbers, there's links all the way through here. You'll get all of this material and the backing up material behind it in your inbox. So you'll have these slides and all of the info coming at you. So don't feel like you've got to try to write down all the URLs we're sharing. That will all get mailed to you. All right. So without further ado, let's get this show on the road. Justin, Tom, you ready?
Yes, I am.
We're doing it. All right. So we have joining us today, Justin with NORML. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I am Justin with NORML, and this is what my voice sounds like.
All right. And we've got Tom with Marijuana Moment.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Angell.
You want to, Justin, what's NORML?
So NORML stands for the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Much like many other groups, we have decided just to have our name be an acronym. We're an organization that's been around since 1970, and we have the very good fortune of having grassroots advocates, activists, and concerned citizens around the country who have organized NORML chapters locally to petition either their city councils, state lawmakers, or just to promote public education for the advancement of marijuana policy reform that ends the criminalization of marijuana and regulates it as analogous substances that deem it worthy, be it for therapeutic medicinal use or for responsible adult use.
So a bit of a good year for you, as we'll cover.
It's been a very good year, but still hundreds of thousands of Americans were put in handcuffs this year, predominantly Black, brown, and poor communities. So, you know, it'll be a much better year when we end criminalization.
All right, yet a ways to go. Tom, what would you say you do?
I've been working on and tracking cannabis policy for about 20 years now. For most of that time, working as an activist for various nonprofits in the space, like Students for Sensible Drug Policy, Marijuana Policy Project, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, and Marijuana Majority, which is a nonprofit that I founded several years ago. And in 2017, I founded Marijuana Moment and have since been primarily working as a journalist in this space, trying to track all the many marijuana policy developments that happen on the state, local, federal, and international levels, as well as things related to the industry side, science and health, and culture. There's a lot to keep track of, and we're trying to do our best every day.
All pretty darn interesting. So you guys are my panel. I am Karen. I'll just be trying to lead us through this conversation. I am with LegiNation, the makers of BillTrack50, and we're just a legislation tracking tool. And I saw a lot of marijuana legislation going across my site this year, so I thought this would be a great topic for us to look back, see what all happened this year. So we'll be talking about a lot of legislation and a few other topics. All right, so here's the agenda. A little bit of background about kind of where we're at with marijuana. Most of you are going to be familiar with this. We won't take much time with it. Then we'll get into the bills and some of the trends we see. And then we'll talk about more broadly politics and kind of the direction everything is going. And then we'll have a Q&A so that we can follow up on any of these topics that you thought were interesting. So let's dive right in. The background. So I'm a data visualization girl. I do like the occasional chart. So thought we'd kick us off with a good quote that we should all keep in mind from our patron saint, Jeff Sessions. Okay, so I forget which one of you brought me this poll, but here we go. Picture of how Americans favor marijuana usage. So you started right around the beginning of this chart, right, Justin?
Well, I only started a couple years ago. NORML was founded in 1970.
Right. So that's quite the sea change, really.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, to keep in, just pointing out 2/3 of Americans now favor making marijuana legal. And then we have a look across the country at the states that have legalized recreational marijuana, as Justin put it, for responsible adults, and kind of how that came through. So you'll see that most of them are not through legislation, but rather through initiatives. So that's that picture. And then I grabbed a map from the NORML website showing what's legal where. So besides recreational, there's also medicinal and other topics. And so you can view this map in detail and look at your state in detail on the NORML website. But just to give us a picture, pretty much something's legal almost everywhere. So
Karen, this is Tom. Can I note a quick trend here on these two last maps? So as you pointed out on the last slide, Karen, the majority of states that have legalized marijuana for adult use to date have done so through ballot measures. Only 2 have done so through state legislative action. That was the case for a very long time when it came to medical cannabis laws as well. But after voters kept overwhelmingly approving such ballot measures, legislatures finally got the picture. And now the majority of state medical cannabis laws have been enacted through legislatures. And that's a trend we expect to see happen with broader adult use legalization as well, going into 2020 and beyond.
Sort of hearts have been broken. It's time to just shoot them in.
Well, to piggyback on Tom's addition, it's also worth noting that many of the medical programs or the medicinal CBD programs that were passed by state legislatures were often much more constrained and restrictive than those passed by citizen referendum. For example, in states like Pennsylvania that has a medicinal program, initially their program was limited. It prevented the herbal use of cannabis. It had a restrictive qualifying conditions list. Fortunately, we've been able through citizen activism to really bring to light the need to expand those programs, and slowly but surely we're adding more qualifying conditions. You know, in Pennsylvania, my example, we now it's legal for herbal cannabis. But you know, there's still a long way to go, and in many of those medical CBD states, that there isn't even an in-state production for that. So the only way it's legal for someone with a qualifying condition that has a medical recommendation, or even if it's just a medical affirmative defense, so that way if they're arrested, then they can go to court and get their case dismissed. Theoretically, the product needs to fall from the heavens and land in their hand because there's no legal way for them to purchase it.
Right. So, as you said, ways to go yet, but things are going that direction. All right. So another set of charts to give us some background about why we might be seeing all the bills we're seeing is the states that have legalized. So starting with Colorado and Washington, they have the longest history, the revenue they've been bringing in from the marijuana trade. And then the other states that have legalized recreational marijuana, and you can see up and to the right. So there's money here, and that's part of, I think, one of the themes that we'll be seeing as we go through. All right. So let's actually dig into some of the bills and talk about what happened in 2019. All right. So I've highlighted the bienniums here. So looking at 2013, 2014, there was 1,983 bills that had the word marijuana or cannabis or CBD in them. All right. And so then and I highlighted there DC because that was an interesting thing that happened in those 2 years. They voted to legalize, and their laws have to get approved by Congress, and Congress did not care to let them have that law. Is that about correct, Justin?
Sort of. So DC, we have to have, I'm a DC resident. Yep. We have to have our budgets approved by the Congress. So Congress, a representative from Maryland named Andy Harris put forward a rider on the appropriations package that oversees DC spending to prevent the district from collecting taxes from adult use. So in DC, it's legal to possess, it's legal to cultivate up to 6 plants, and it's legal to gift marijuana. So when you come and visit me, Karen, I can give you up to an ounce, but it is not legal for commercial activity.
Okay, good distinction. And so that was stuck in the Cromnibus, if you guys remember that whole situation. All right, and then and of course, Colorado and Washington had legalized back in 2012 and 2011, 2012. All right, so then California was in the 15-16 timeframe, even though that wasn't legislation. Lots of bills obviously came up. So you can see there's been an increasing number of bills each year. And this last year, 2019, there was 2,551, and that was just 1 year out of 2. So we're looking at a whole lot of bills in this biennium, and presumably lots more every year. It's just going to be part of the bread and butter of legislators, I think, going forward for some time to come. Are there any highlights you want to hit from here? Maybe Illinois?
The only thing I would say about this slide is just, as you noted, we're seeing more and more legislation over time. And once you enact a new medical cannabis or broader legalization law in a state, it doesn't stop there. Lawmakers then want to get involved in tinkering with tax rates and plant counts and track and trace requirements and other regulations. And so, what you're seeing is as more new laws come online, there are more efforts by lawmakers to try to amend and expand or restrict those laws.
Right. Things like expungement. So this is our first category that I thought we would talk about. Who wants to tackle what this is even about?
I do. So on average, 660,000 plus Americans are put into handcuffs every single year for the past 3 years for a marijuana-related offense, and many of them, end up, as they work their way through the criminal justice system, are either thrown out or people defeat the cases, but hundreds of thousands of individuals still get a criminal record every year, and that criminal record follows you and harms you way beyond just the initial infraction or the penalties that you may get in a court of law. It means that whenever you apply for a job, you have to check the box saying that you have a criminal record. When you apply for housing, when you apply for financial aid for higher education, when there's a litany of other areas where people are systemically discriminated against as a result of having a criminal record. So what an expungement does is it gets it off of your record. It's important to note that there are 2 different types of remediation for past criminal record. One is what we call expungement. The second one is called sealing. And many lawmakers like to purport that sealing is the equivalent of expungement, but it's not. It's expungement light. Because while your record wouldn't come up on just a general record search, it would still come up through databases should you have another interaction with law enforcement, or should you go back to court for another related incident. So that way you can still have a compounded sentence for a future violation, even as a result of a previously sealed indictment.
Good distinction. So you can see from the map here that most states are arguing over this. The darker the color, the more bills have been put forward since 2013. So, it's very much a topic, but not all states have passed expungement rules about marijuana, right?
Yeah, and there's a wide variety of ways that this could be enacted or just set up as a procedure. Some states, they require you to wait a period of time after you fulfilled whatever sentence that had been handed down. Some states have really hyper restrictive aspects of what types of records can be expunged. Say it's in Hawaii, they just passed a decriminalization and expungement law, but it's only for up to 3 grams of marijuana, which, as many of our attendees, might have never bought less than 3.5 grams of marijuana at a time. So, commonly referred to as an eighth. These are things that we got to keep in mind for what it actually means. I will do a big hat tip to our friends in Illinois, where as part of their legalization initiative, it included automatic provisions, so that way an individual doesn't even need to go through the bureaucratic hoops of filing for an expungement, and it'll be automatically done on their behalf. In our view here at NORML, that's a critically important differential, because often, even if you have a pathway to obtain an expungement, it's still an onerous process. You got to fill out paperwork. Oftentimes, you have to pay an associated fee. You have to wait a period of time. Whatever other circumstances might be. That's still time that person is being impacted, and that's can add to it. And in this country, it is expensive to be poor. So for those who most need that relief, to no longer have to check the box on a job application or for whatever other reasons, that's just another barrier preventing them from obtaining it. So I like to point out, in Illinois, many jurisdictions in California, many other jurisdictions around the country are implementing these kind of automatic expungement policies. And when people go and talk with their policymakers about what they'd like to see done, they should demand automatic expungement.
All right. So that is definitely a trend we're going to see as states legalize more and more discussion of what to do with criminal records, right? All right. So anti-discrimination. So we had a couple different categories, but there's lots more. Tom, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, just quickly, I would say, as is the case with expungements, when you legalize marijuana in a state and remove criminalization for possession and certain amount of sales, that's not the end of the story. In addition to the prior records that Justin just spent several minutes talking about, you have ongoing discrimination for cannabis consumers when it comes to child custody, when it comes to your ability to get insurance. You can be fired from your job. Sometimes you can lose access to housing because of ongoing federal prohibition. So, these are ongoing efforts that will happen in states even after they legalize to completely remove discrimination from cannabis consumers.
So that's another type of legislation we expect to see more and more of. All right, and then we've got, depending on how the legalization took place and what was in the original bill, like you said, with the CBD oil, if you can't buy it legally, then that's weird. So there's the whole supply chain, right? There's like who can grow it. And then once it's been grown, what happens to it? Who can package it and distribute it? And what kind of labeling has to be on that? And then, what kind of establishments can sell it? And what requirements do they have? Do they have to check IDs, or are they only allowed to sell a certain amount? Or, like all of those kinds of things. So just the whole entire marketplace has to get worked out in each state. So I'm going to go to both of you, but Justin, what are some bills you thought were interesting dealing with the marketplace this year?
There's a lot of things, so I'll try to keep it on specific topics. For growing, home cultivation, in our opinion, is a critical component for individuals to be able to do legally. There are a number of states that have legalized. Only 2 of them have not included lawful home cultivation in some limited capacity, and those are Washington and Illinois. The reason why it's critical is that it takes away the ability for law enforcement to enter someone's home without a warrant, just on a suspicion of home cultivation. So it's a critical civil liberties aspect for that we need to have. When it comes to distribution and just overall licensing systems, NORML doesn't take hard stances on, this is the type of model that you should have, or these are the type of models you should stay away from. But we broadly say that there should be a robust number of licenses offered for qualified entrepreneurs and aspiring businesses to prevent a consolidation of the market, which would then in turn, limit consumer choice, consumer access, and more likely lead to higher costs. So we think that there should, in many states, they've been doing what's known as vertically integrated systems, where they only allow maybe 6 companies, for example, in Florida, to get access to those licenses, and they have to control every aspect from cultivation to manufacture to distribution. Other states, they follow a 3-tiered model, so analogous to alcohol, for production, distribution, transportation, etc. And our view is just there needs to be a lot of people who are allowed to get to the market to best serve consumers.
Let me just expand on that home grow point that Justin just made. Here in New York, there is a medical cannabis trade association that represents the licensed growers and dispensaries here in this state. And they sent a memo to New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, which Marijuana Moment obtained through a public records request, which specifically asked the governor, who had announced he was planning on putting legalization language in his annual budget request. They wanted him to include a ban on home cultivation. And they couched it in public safety terms, but a lot of observers, including NORML's executive director, who we got a quote from for our story, seemed to think it was a pretty self-serving move on the part of those businesses, which would presumably be selling to all adults under broader legalization. And when consumers aren't able to grow their own marijuana at home, they're going to have to buy it from licensed businesses. And it turns out the governor went ahead and accepted that request from the industry association and did not allow home grow in his budget proposal. That wasn't actually enacted this year. There was some quibbling in the legislature with regard to tax revenue and how that would be allocated. So legalization didn't get across the finish line this year, but perhaps the backlash to that memo will lead to different legislation being proposed here next year.
And there's no tangible, or maybe Tom will dispute this and then he can send it to me. But I've seen no real compelling data that shows that home cultivation leads, by allowing limited home cultivation, it leads to an increased massive amount of diversion into the black market, or an undercutting of potential revenue for state licensed businesses. There are other aspects that we need to address in a better way through public policy to make the business climate more friendly for consumers. But criminalizing limited home cultivation is not one of them.
Interesting. Okay. So that's just the beginning of some of the marketplace stuff, but yeah, those are going to be some bills we're going to see as well. Very good. All right, and then Justin.
I was just going to say, so as I mentioned, there were a couple of governors who put legalization language in their budget proposals to the legislature this year. Cuomo in New York was one, and Raimondo in Rhode Island was another. They included language that, if enacted, would have actually legalized marijuana in their states. And then in New Jersey and Illinois, there was discussion in the governor's budget documents about allocating revenue from legalization that they expected to later happen in the year, which did happen in Illinois, has not yet happened in New Jersey. So Governor Murphy had, I forget the exact figure, but several $1 million worth of revenue he was counting on in his budget. That's not going to be there next year. But it looks like lawmakers are going to put a legalization referendum on the 2020 ballot in the Garden State for voters to decide on. So perhaps in in coming fiscal years, that revenue will be there.
Yep, it is tempting. All those graphs up and to the right. Yep. All right, and then we wanted to pull out some very specific bills to highlight. And I'll just, who wants to tackle the Washington bill?
The Oregon one here.
Sorry, the Oregon bill.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, I suggested this as a pretty interesting example of a unique bill we saw for the first time this year. And it's one that passed the legislature in Oregon and it was signed by Governor Kate Brown in June, that would allow the interstate interstate commerce of marijuana through neighboring states. So Oregon, I mean Washington and California, basically.
Right.
It's contingent on a change in federal policy, however. So even though that state law is enacted, its provisions won't really take effect until either federal prohibition is formally ended or there's some kind of Justice Department memo that specifically allows for that kind of interstate activity.
I think we'll probably come back to that. All right, so we've already spoken of the legalization and what was in that bill. Justin, you mentioned some different things. Justin, you also mentioned the Hawaii bill, but do you want to talk a little bit more? You said the issue there was the quantity, right?
Yeah, it's 3 grams decriminalization and expungement for convictions of under 3 grams, which again, it's a minuscule amount. I mean, it's essentially protecting tourists and locals who may have a joint or two, depending on how big they roll them. Maybe if 5 or 6 if you roll them small. But it's really an insignificant amount of cannabis, and this is the smallest decriminalization bill that I'm aware of ever being seriously considered, let alone enacted.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but it happened.
Yeah, Governor Iggy, and Democrat of Hawaii, is notoriously terrible on marijuana policy. He actually vetoed a bill that would have added opioid dependence to the state's qualifying conditions list for their medical program earlier. It was this year or last year?
I think it was last year.
Yeah, last year. So he's no friend. So it was a sad compromise, but sometimes you got to get that chink in the wall to be able to really grow it.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened in New Mexico?
This New Mexico one is another example of a pretty unique proposal, something that we haven't really seen a lot of elsewhere, and that is a bill that the State House of Representatives actually passed this year, but later died in the Senate, and so didn't make it to the governor's desk, would have legalized marijuana and put sales largely in state-run stores as opposed to private businesses that are licensed by the state, which the case in all the other states that have legalized so far, the sales are conducted through private businesses that have license they've received from the state. This would actually have the state selling weed to adults, which is pretty unique.
Do you anticipate that bill coming back?
There was a task force that the governor appointed several months ago that issued a report to her that recommended not going that route. And they have a short session in 2020. I believe it's just a 30-day session coming up in January. So New Mexico could actually be the next state in the U.S. to legalize marijuana if all goes according to the governor's plan there. But it's looking like it won't be that state-run sales model.
State-run source. That is an interesting bill to highlight, though. So each one of these bills is a link. So when you get this presentation in your inbox, you can actually go check out the bills to see more of the details. Interested in a deeper dive. And then, of course, we've got lots of ballot measures coming up.
Yeah, and these states listed here, there aren't any initiatives that have qualified for the 20 ballot yet. Some have been formally filed and activists are currently collecting signatures. Others are, the language is sort of still in the works. But this is a list of states where you could reasonably see measures on state ballots to either legalize marijuana for adult use or enact a new medical cannabis program.
Or both.
2020. Right.
All right, so that's sort of a preview going forward, but not legislation, rather ballot measures. Okay, so let's talk even further, just in general, not just 2020, but longer term. So I just put together a couple numbers for us. We already pointed out that 2/3 of Americans now favor legalization. And I meant to look up the 52 billion number. Do you guys know, does that include legal and illegal, or is that just legal?
I'm not familiar with that stat offhand. I would assume it's legal regulated sales are projecting.
I've got the link there though. But anyway, quite a bit of commerce taking place, and then nearly 500,000 jobs are involved in the growing and distribution and retail and all of that, right? Mm-hmm. All right, so that is kind of the picture for what politicians are going to care about, among other things. So let's talk about the evolving kind of positions of both sides. So who wants to take what direction Republicans?
Yeah, I'll go with that. So, President Donald Trump does not personally support legalizing marijuana, but he has said on a number of occasions that he supports medical cannabis. He says he knows people who benefit from it, and he says that he supports the right of states to enact their own legalization laws without federal interference, although his former attorney general, who was quoted at the beginning of the slideshow, did rescind an Obama-era memo that gave guidance to federal prosecutors, basically telling them to respect state marijuana laws. That said, even though that memo, the Cole memo, was effectively thrown in the trash can by Sessions, there hasn't been any federal crackdown on state legal marijuana businesses. So beyond President Trump, in Congress, you're seeing more and more Republicans who are becoming comfortable with embracing the sort of states' rights approach to marijuana, whereby, they're not saying we love weed, we think people should smoke it. They're not even necessarily saying we would vote to legalize marijuana in our state. They're simply saying, hey, if a state wants to do this, that's fine. It's not a good use of federal resources to get in there and start harassing people and sending them to jail. That said, and I think Justin will talk about this in a second with the Democrats, there seems to be much broader embracing of not just legalizing marijuana outright on the Democratic side of the aisle, but also making sure that legalization policies include restorative justice measures to make people whole who've been previously harmed by the drug war. And I guess, Justin, if you want to talk about that in the context of the presidential race in Congress.
Yeah. I would say one other thing, one thing to add, though, for Republicans. There's an interesting split among what the states' rights approach actually means and whether or not and what role that means for federal policy. There's two leading bills right now. The one led which would reform the Controlled Substances Act to have the Schedule I standing of marijuana not be applicable to the states that have reformed their policies, but maintain the federal policy of prohibition and criminalization. And then the other one, which is just a clean removal of marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act, but not amend any other aspects of federal policy to acknowledge the legalization. So that's just one interesting caveat to add about Republicans. For Democrats, yeah, as Tom said, addressing the harms of criminalization is a key component for Democrats that they'd like to address, particularly through two different lenses. One, through the expungements of criminal records. Again, as we talked about earlier with expungements, like the collateral consequences associated with having a criminal record as a result of a marijuana charge or any other charge, can be lifelong, and especially when we're talking about young people who may be in the prime of their earning potential or really at the beginning of when they lay the foundation for their career, which will determine their overall economic output and income throughout their life. If you're kneecapped at the beginning, then that severely brings down that overall trend line of your earning potential. So it's an economic justice argument that many Democrats are making for the need for expungements, as well as in the emerging industry, as a result of many different aspects of American culture and society, but in particular with marijuana, the associated costs of navigating the federal prohibition versus state legal regulatory frameworks. The costs of having a marijuana business are exceedingly high. Cannabis companies don't have access to basic banking services. One of the talking points I use with lawmakers all the time is, I can't imagine running my personal life without a bank account. Right. So I certainly cannot imagine running a business without one.
Or a $52 billion industry.
Yeah. And, now many more and more credit unions and local banks are navigating that, and providing services to cannabis companies, but they're doing so by charging a special fee for taking on that added risk. So that's just another cost that's being added to the business. and tax deductions. There's a discrepancy in tax treatment, but we don't need to get into that now. But no, so there, what we're seeing is a very white, well-capitalized marketplace when it comes to ownership, management, and workers in the cannabis space. So many Democrats are now prioritizing pathways to opportunity and ownership for those in minority and impacted communities, particularly in recently introduced legislation that just passed in House Judiciary on the 20th of November, known as the MORE Act. It would create a separate stream of funding for the Small Business Administration to specifically provide microloans and services to people who fall under a definition of impacted community, which includes, disproportionately more people of color and people from lower down the socioeconomic ladder. So it's again yet another economic justice argument that the Democrats are making here when it comes to this evolving space and the growth of this nascent legal industry that already has a dedicated consumer base. It's unprecedented with the exception of alcohol prohibition.
And I think it's worth specifying here that with the exception of former Vice President Joe Biden and former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, every single Democratic presidential candidate has personally said that they support legalizing marijuana and federally descheduling it. Biden, who was a champion of many of our nation's harsh drug laws that are on the books now as a senator, has actually evolved his position somewhat, not to go so far as to say he wants to legalize or deschedule, but he supports decriminalization, he supports medical cannabis, he supports medical marijuana. Sorry, I just said that. He supports a modest rescheduling of marijuana down to Schedule 2, which is not nearly as impactful as removing it from the Controlled Substances Act altogether. And he supports expungements and letting states set their own laws. Bloomberg hasn't really spoken about it much since earlier this year when he called marijuana, quote, the stupidest thing anybody has ever done. But perhaps he will see the need to evolve his position a little bit as he gets out on the campaign trail and is asked about the issue.
All right. So in summary, both parties moving vaguely towards legalization at least, but for different reasons and with different.
And it's also worth noting, Bill, talking about the Republican presidential race, because there is one, even though it's very, 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 very long shot campaigns. Former Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld is in support of legalization, and Mark Sanford dropped out, so I don't need to talk about him.
And Joe Walsh is in there, and he supports states' rights, but nobody's really paying attention to him.
All right, but no, you're right to point that out. All right, so we talked about equity for historically targeted communities. You covered that when you were talking about the Democrats, but that is another kind of political trend we're seeing is how far we want to go with that, right? And certainly in the primary being discussed a little bit. So we've already spent time on that. I'm going to move on to federal issues. So you mentioned descheduling. We mentioned marijuana across state lines when we were talking about the Oregon bill. We touched on DC legalization. But kind of the big one to me is banking. So let's start there and see where we run out of time.
Okay, I'll start just by noting that in September, the House of Representatives overwhelmingly, with a bipartisan margin, passed a bill to protect banks that service state legal cannabis business from being punished by federal regulators in an effort to solve those earlier problems, those problems Justin talked about earlier. It's pretty uncertain what's going to happen in the Senate. The chairman of the banking committee, Mike Crapo from Idaho, who's a Republican, earlier said he did not want to take up cannabis banking legislation as long as marijuana remains illegal under federal law. However, more recently, he has said he actually wanted to hold a vote on a bill in his panel by the end of the year, but said that he might want some changes from what the House passed. More recently, however, I think expectations have dimmed a little bit that they'll be able to get that done by the end of this year, just because, oh, look, it's already December and there's nothing on the calendar for his committee yet. So we'll see. That might move into 2020, and it'll be interesting to see exactly what kind of changes he tries to move through his panel, and whether the Democratic-controlled House will happily accept those in order to get a bill to the president's desk. And it's also worth saying, like, even if it clears Crapo's committee, we don't necessarily know that Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who loves hemp but has said he's not a fan of its illicit cousin marijuana, will even bring it to the floor. So there's that whole question mark too.
But as more states legalize marijuana, I mean, they're gonna have to figure something out. Yeah.
I mean, I think that a lot of people who focus on policy and politics and economics often will claim, oh, we won't let it get that bad. I mean, we've let it got this bad.
It's bad.
So just picking up on what Tom brought up about Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, he is, love him, hate him, whatever. If you have an opinion on him, you have to acknowledge that he is one of the most skilled and effective legislators in the history of this country, right? Mm-hmm. And the politics of marijuana policy are rapidly evolving. When we look at the Senate map for who's up for re-election in 2020, it's worth noting that many of the most endangered Republican incumbents are representing states that either have legalized marijuana, in the case of Susan Collins in Maine and Cory Gardner in Colorado, or Martha McSally, or they're going to have on the ballot in 2020, like Martha McSally in Arizona, and a number of other states. So it's the question that only Mitch McConnell will answer is, will he create the space for him to rapidly evolve when it comes to a policy that addresses marijuana, in order to help him protect his majority should it become a political issue, which I imagine, while it won't be a top political issue, it will certainly be in the strong second tier of topics discussed amongst voters in those states.
Right. Mitch McConnell might not like hemp's illicit cousin, as he calls it, but he does like having the title Majority Leader. So we'll see.
Imagine that. All right. So that brings us to the end of our presentation, and we have a few minutes to tackle some of the questions that have come in. So if you were saving any questions, please go ahead and enter them in. But I think you guys have been trying to keep up with them a little bit, but let's take a look here. So do we think that the Commonwealth of Virginia or other states will put in state-run dispensaries? So we talked about that a little bit in New Mexico. That is kind of a surprising thing. Do we think that will happen anywhere?
I think it's entirely possible, but I think it's unlikely. I think it's possible we might see it with medical programs in some of the more conservative states. It might get addressed, but I think for a lot of lawmakers, it's something that at the end of alcohol prohibition, at a time when we didn't have the technology that we do now, state-run dispensaries for the intoxicant that we refer to as alcohol seemed much more politically palatable. Now there's a lot of companies out there who are running around selling seed-to-sale tracking systems and other aspects of tracking regulated lawful marijuana commerce that are much more palatable to lawmakers than having to set up their own bureaucratic structure for a state-run.
Yep.
One funny wrinkle that I forgot to mention about the New Mexico state-run marijuana stores bill earlier is that idea was actually put forth by Republicans in the legislature, which is interesting, given that party's general, small government, let's bolster private enterprise point of view. I guess in this case, those lawmakers kind of set those principles aside because maybe they had broader concerns about, a profit-driven industry selling marijuana to people in a commercialized fashion, and so they were okay with having the state do that in a more relaxed manner.
Which also just, it's worth pointing out, like, state-run dispensaries, I think, are entirely feasible alternative model to privatization and commercialization of the cannabis marketplace. And, I can say as a consumer who has purchased alcohol in Massachusetts and who's purchased it in New Hampshire,
Right.
it was much, much less expensive in New Hampshire at the state-run dispensary of alcohol. So, it's something that if you feel like in your state you should talk to people about it. If you're not already in the local NORML chapter, talk to the local NORML chapter. If there isn't one, start your own. And if that's something that you want to advocate for, then that's something that you should absolutely do so.
Well, it would be interesting to see some states try. I mean, it's nice when we try different approaches. All
In the laboratories of democracy.
Yes, indeed. Next question. The most often ignored piece of the cannabis market is waste disposal. Due to the strictness of waste regulations in many states, cannabis operators cannot legally recycle their waste, even e-waste, so it must all go to the landfill. Colorado just passed a bill which will allow for the recycling of cannabis waste starting next year. Do you see other states following suit? How concerned are you about the overpackaging of cannabis and hemp products?
That's a really good question, Mitchell.
Yeah.
And I think what you're pointing out is an example of how state lawmakers and regulators are perhaps being a little bit overcautious and overburdensome of the newly emerging legal cannabis industry. And there's kind of a trade-off here, and it relates to how activists, even have drafted ballot measures in the past. You got to make sure you get to 50% plus one to pass something, right? And you don't want an attack ad about kids getting access to this, or an attack ad about stone driving, so on and so forth. And so oftentimes compromises have been made to sort of head off those concerns of the past to make sure a bill can get enacted, with the thinking being we can improve this over time. And I think the packaging thing is related to children's access, right? And so I think there probably just needs to be more of a realization and understanding and acceptance that it really is up to parents to make sure that they're being responsible and reasonable and not leaving intoxicating products out where children can get their hands on them and unwittingly ingest them.
Or Tide Pods, for that matter.
Yeah, exactly. So I think probably over time, you'll start to see things, for lack of a better phrase, chill out a little bit as, legalization gets enacted in more places and marijuana becomes more normalized and people are more familiar with it. It's not this weird foreign object, and you start to know cannabis consumers in your daily life, and you see that they are responsible, reasonable people, just like anybody else. Yeah.
Yep. All right. So this puts us at time. So thank you all for coming. Here is our contact info if you want to follow up with any of us. Or of course, you can check out the NORML website, or you could check out Marijuana Moment, or look up any bills you want at BillTrack50. But thank you all for coming. Hopefully you found this interesting, and some of the links will be helpful to you for research. And yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Guys, Justin and Tom?
No, yeah, thank you guys for attending. And seriously, if you haven't, know who your state rep is, know who your state senator is, contact them, bug them. Like it is needed. When people raise their voices, then that's how we get things done.
All right.
Recent history certainly shows things getting done. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. And, hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar.
See you in 2020. Bye.
Bye.